Let's take a moment and generate our motivation and appreciate our precious human life, appreciate the opportunity that we have right now to listen to the Buddhist teachings, to contemplate them, to integrate them in our lives. And so let's do this not just for our own benefit, but really feeling ourselves as part of the bigger whole of all sentient life, and realizing that everybody wants happiness and freedom from suffering just like we do. And also noting that our whole life really depends on the efforts and energies of others. Then let's generate compassion and love and an altruistic intention to follow the path to full awakening, so that we can have the wisdom and compassion and skillful means to be of the greatest benefit to all beings. So let's just make that our intention for being together this evening. So I was asked to speak tonight about Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions, which is also the name of the new book that just came out. It was an incredible privilege for me, actually, to work on this book. And I don't know what I did in a previous life to create the merit, but somehow the opportunity came about. And His Holiness was really very firm about wanting a book that would help draw the different Buddhist traditions together by showing the commonalities between the practices and the teachings. Showing the commonalities, but not whitewashing the differences, respecting the differences too. And this is his approach, actually, with any kind of anything dialogue, like when he talks to people of other religions, he says, there was once he was dialoguing with one Catholic priest who said, well, we're all going up the same mountain, and His Holiness says, well, it is different paths, and we can get along even if we don't have the same beliefs, because a lot of people think that unless we believe the same thing and make it all one, that there's no way to get along. But His Holiness's thing is, there's commonalities between different religions, a lot of commonalities between different Buddhist traditions, but we don't need to say that everything's exactly the same in order to honor and respect each other. And I must say that one of the chief things that I came out of this project learning was what an amazingly skillful teacher the Buddha was, because I had to do a lot of study, and I traveled and spoke to people, teachers from different traditions, and read books, from different traditions and so on. And it just kept coming to me again and again how skillful the Buddha was, because he realized that, spirituality is not one size fits all. It's not, here is the truth, and of course we have it, and you better believe it. Because he realized people have different dispositions, different interests, different inclinations. They're at different spaces, so they need to hear different things at different times. you know. And so being aware of that difference among sentient beings, then he taught a lot of things that were the same, but explained some things in slightly different ways in order to really give what certain groups of people needed at that specific time. Okay? So I really began to appreciate how skillful the Buddha was. And I began to also see how little people from the various Buddhist traditions actually know about each other. I know for myself, because I met the Dharma in the US in '75, and then I went to Nepal and India and studied there, and I was continuously with people in the Tibetan tradition until 87. And when my teacher sent me to Singapore, okay, and I didn't expect to go to Singapore, but I wound up there, you know, kind of. I got this message, do not pass go, do not collect $200, go directly to Singapore. So I went. And what was so interesting for me there is that there were so many different Buddhist traditions. Yeah, because at the time I went, there were maybe 2, possibly 3 Tibetan groups. This was in '87. There were many Chinese temples that, you know, gave the Dharma in Chinese. And then there were various Theravada groups from Burma, from Thailand, you know, from all over the Theravada world, because Singapore is down at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, you know, so people from Sri Lanka came, you know, everybody came there. And then all of a sudden I was exposed to different types of Buddhism. And I had, the only knowledge I really had about them was what I had heard from my own teachers. Now, you have to remember that, you know, the Buddha taught the 6th century BC, and then the teachings started spreading all over India, South India, East India, you know, they spread far and wide, and there weren't very many good communication networks, yeah, until this century, and travel was very difficult. So people, whatever people knew about other traditions was basically just kind of what they had heard somebody else mention. You know, they had never really, Tibetans had never talked to anybody from Sri Lanka or Thailand, you know. And the Chinese, you know, didn't know very much about Tibetans, except for the few who came to China. So, you know, what I found out when I was living in Singapore is there's all these misconceptions. So, you know, the Tibetans look at the Chinese and think that they all do blank-minded meditation, because in the 8th century there was a debate in Samye between one Chinese abbot and Kamalashila. So 12 centuries later, now 13 centuries later, the Chinese still all do blank-minded meditation, the Tibetans think. You know, and then of course, you know, we Tibetans, we follow the Mahayana, you know, not the Hinayana, you know, the lower vehicle, because all those people are so selfish, you know, they just want their own awakening and that's it. You know, so the Tibetans had those ideas. And then, of course, the Theravada people looked at the Tibetans and thought, these people don't practice Vinaya, you know, because they're dressed in monastic robes, but, you know, they eat in the afternoon and they handle money and blah, blah, blah. And, you know, and then the Sri Lanka, the Theravadas looked at the Chinese and said they just do a lot of ritual, yeah. And then, of course, the Chinese looked at the Tibetans. Everybody looked at the Tibetans, Chinese and Theravadas, and thought all we did was magic, and that everybody was sleeping around with everybody and drinking alcohol because we practiced Tantra. So, you know, it was an excellent opportunity being there to see the misconceptions I had, and then also to try and educate people about the misconceptions that they had, you know, about different traditions. It was really quite a wonderful experience. So when His Holiness asked me to work on the book, I already had a little bit of familiarity with the different traditions, especially I had taken my Bhikshuni ordination in China, so I had spent, not in China, in Taiwan, so I had spent a couple of months there, and I had also been to Tibet and to China a couple of times. You know, I went to visit a Thai monastery, which was really interesting because they don't have fully ordained nuns there. Actually, the Tibetans don't either. I went to Taiwan to take the full ordination, but then when I went to Thailand, they basically didn't know what to do with me, you know, because we can't put her with the monks, you know, but we can't put her with the lay people, you know. So it was very interesting to kind of see how all this worked out. I was really easy with the whole thing. But it was a wonderful experience, really learning from practitioners of the different traditions. So, I was trying to think, you know, today, like what points of the book to emphasize to you. And it's hard to know. I mean, I thought maybe I should talk a little bit about the idea of who the Buddha is according to the different traditions, yeah? Because we all take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and in many ways the idea of who the Buddha is very similar, but also in some ways it's different, you know? So everybody agrees that the Buddha was a human being, you know, on our planet, 5-6 centuries BC, and that he, you know, was the son of a king, a great leader, and renounced the life and attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, and then taught for 45 years and passed into parinirvana. So everybody pretty much agrees on that part, the basic biography that we have, and we all find the biography of the Buddha very inspiring. Okay. Where the differences come in is that for the Theravada tradition, the Buddha really was a human being. He had clearly practiced the Dharma in the past. He had made a vow to become a fully awakened Buddha, you know, in previous eons. And so he was already somewhat advanced on the path when he took rebirth in this life. And then he actually attained full awakening when he meditated under the Bodhi tree. From the Mahayana viewpoint, the Buddha was actually enlightened a long time ago, and the appearance as Siddhartha or as Shakyamuni was an appearance for the benefit of sentient beings, you know, because by showing the aspect of being an ordinary being who then, you know, had to deal with his parents freaking out because he wasn't doing what they wanted, and, you know, kind of the regular things that we have to deal with, that by the Buddha living that kind of life and showing that example, it was in itself a teaching for us. Yeah, so there's a difference, you know. Oh, the Buddha was enlightened a long time ago, and this was just an example he was showing for sentient beings. Okay, and then, you know, from the Theravada viewpoint, when somebody attains nirvana, okay, the cessation of suffering, well, they don't. For them, there's a little bit of difference between liberation, the nirvana that is liberation, and the nirvana of full awakening. Okay? Because they would say, yes, the Buddha was an arhat, he's a fully awakened one, which means that he turned the wheel of Dharma in a time in the world when there were no other Buddhas alive. Okay, so he was unique in that way, but his realizations were basically the realizations of all of the great arhats at his time. It's just that the Buddha had made some prayers before to be a wheel-turning Buddha, you know. From the Mahayana viewpoint, there's quite a difference between liberation and full awakening. You know, we say that an arhat has eliminated what we call the afflictive obscurations, so ignorance, anger, and attachment, and the karma that causes rebirth and cyclic existence. But an arhat has not eliminated the cognitive obscurations, which is the subtle dualistic view and the very subtle imprints on the mind that cause that dualistic view. Yeah, and so from the Mahayana viewpoint, there's quite a difference between an arhat and a Buddha, and also in their capabilities. Okay, so from the Theravada viewpoint, when a Buddha or an arhat passes away into parinirvana, in the Pali scriptures, they don't talk a lot about what happens there. So some of the Theravada people say that at that point, the consciousness kind of ceases. Their idea being that rebirth is taken due to craving. So an arhat has ceased craving. So therefore, the rebirth process has ceased. Yeah, and so the consciousness with craving, when they leave, you know, this body, then all of that has ceased, and the consciousness ceases, but they're still in nirvana. So it's a little bit difficult to explain because you have nirvana, but without a person who is in nirvana. Yeah. So some people, some Theravadas believe that. There is and His Holiness loved this story when I told him. There was in early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, there was a Thai monk, Achan Mun, and he was a very great meditator, and he had visions of the Buddha and the great arhats, leading him to believe that no, the continuation of their consciousness did not cease when they left the contaminated body. So that was a new viewpoint, you know. Okay, I don't know statistically how many people in the Theravada world believe this, you know. But from the Mahayana viewpoint, then since the Buddha in this lifetime was a manifestation to start with for the benefit of sentient beings, then when the Buddha, you know, dies, basically that appearance is being withdrawn, and the consciousness, the stream of mind of a fully awakened one never ceases, because, you know, the whole reason that the Buddha practiced for eons and eons was to attain full awakening, and it wouldn't make sense for him to attain full awakening, teach for 45 years on our planet, and then his consciousness ceases after spending eons, you know, practicing the path to become a Buddha. So, you know, from the Mahayana tradition, then they speak of the 4 bodies of the Buddha, and how, you know, the continuum of an enlightened mind never stops because there's nothing to make it stop. And because a Buddha's mind stream is totally purified, then, you know, a Buddha has the ability to manifest many, many different bodies in different forms, in different universes, all at the same time, in order to be of great benefit to sentient beings. Okay, so that's a kind of a big difference, you know. Also, the from the Theravada viewpoint, they say that while they say the Buddha is all-knowing, but not omniscient. And there is a sutra in the Pali tradition that they quote, you know, where the Buddha himself was asked if he's omniscient, and he said no. And so they say that the Buddha could know everything, but he has to turn his mind to that object in order to know it. Whereas from the Mahayana viewpoint, with the idea of the four Buddha bodies, you know, all existence just appeared to the Buddha's mind without him having to turn his mind to that object. So, you know, completely omniscient. Yeah. So, you know, it's interesting to see these kinds of differences, but at the same time to see how all of us have faith in the Buddha, and all of us from the different traditions, you know, find the Buddha's life an incredible example for our own life, and are inspired to follow the path that he followed, and to attain full awakening, liberation, however it is you define that in your own particular school. Okay? There's an, you know, in the Theravada tradition, in the story of the Buddha, they emphasize three qualities that he gained, you know, on the night before his awakening. And the first one was that he saw all of his previous lives. The second one was that he saw sentient beings dying and being reborn. And the third one was that after he attained full awakening, was he was able to look at his own mind stream and say, the holy life has been completed, all the afflictions have been eliminated, you know, and to see that he was fully awakened. Okay, so they talk a lot about those three. They're called higher knowledges or realizations that the Buddha gained. And in thinking about those, you know, I thought about those a lot, and I saw some similarities. You know, you can see sometimes how ideas in the Mahayana build upon things that the Buddha taught in the Pali tradition. So let me ask you this. If you saw all of your previous lives, what do you think your response would be? Yeah, Cheryl's going, ah. Right, wouldn't it? It would be, ah. And what would you want to do? Get out. Yeah. So what would your response be? Renunciation. Determination to be free. I saw all my previous lives. Ah, I don't want to be in that situation again. I want out of cyclic existence. Okay. Then the second one, when the Buddha saw other sentient beings dying and being reborn according to their karma. So imagine for a minute you could, you know, just clairvoyantly, you saw sentient beings dying and being reborn according to their karma. What do you think your response to seeing that would be? Compassion, wouldn't it? Yeah? You see sentient beings dying and being reborn according to their karma. I mean, we would have tremendous compassion for them, for ourselves, for being in that situation. Yeah? And if we were exceptional, we might even, you know, I mean, that compassion is the wish for them to be free of suffering. So we would want to become involved in freeing them from suffering, and thereby want to become fully awakened ourselves so that we could do that. So what's that? Bodhicitta. Okay. Then the third one, yeah, the Buddha was able to look at his mind and say, all the afflictions have been purified. Everything's gone. I've realized reality, and so the ignorance, you know, and all the defilements that are the source of, you know, imprisonment are gone. Yeah. So what do you think that was about? What caused that? Not just merit. What's the one thing that liberates us? The only thing that liberates us? That is the actual thing that destroys the ignorance. Direct realization of emptiness. Okay, so direct realization of the nature of all phenomena, their emptiness of inherent existence. So that's what he was able to see, that he had that, and thereby his mind stream was completely purified. So what are these three that we have? Renunciation, bodhicitta, realization of emptiness. Where have you heard those before? Yeah? Where have you heard those before? Yeah, they're the three principal aspects of the path, aren't they? Yeah, that J. Rinpoche emphasizes in the Tibetan tradition. There they are. That's what the Buddha's experience was. Kind of amazing, isn't it? Yeah? When you look at it that way? And then, another thing, you know, because I was telling you before that the Tibetans all think the Theravadas are very selfish. Yeah. It's wrong, by the way. But most of them don't know that one of the practices in the Theravada tradition is the practice of the four immeasurables. Yeah? So we recited that at the beginning today. You know, may all sentient beings have happiness and its causes, which is love. May all sentient beings be free of suffering and its causes, which is compassion. May all sentient beings never be separated from sorrowless bliss, that's joy. And may all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free of bias, attachment, and anger. That's equanimity. Okay? So these same four are found in the Tibetan tradition, in the Theravada tradition. And the Buddha taught them in the sutras. And in the Theravada commentaries, there's a great deal of explanation about them. And they're taught in the context of generating serenity, shamatha, yeah? Because the idea is that when you meditate on those, you develop, you know, like the mind of love, and then you focus on that. That becomes your object upon which you develop serenity. So I looked in Buddhaghosa. He wrote the Path of Purification, one of the principal commentaries in the Pali tradition, and huge explanation about how to generate love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. And when he was talking about love, you know, then of course he says, well, one of the hindrances to cultivating love is, what's your big hindrance in cultivating love? Anger. Okay. So Buddhaghosa goes into all these different ways to think when you're angry. Many of them overlapped with Shantideva. Yeah, in Guide to a Bodhisattva's Way of Life. Yeah. quite interesting. You know, the four immeasurables, there were many things like this that were in common about them. There were also some points, not that were different, but that were maybe a different emphasis. For example, and I found this really lovely in the Pali tradition. They say for love should, you know, loving kindness, you know, so it doesn't mean romantic love or anything like that. It just means, you know, wishing people well. They say that is the basic way to train the mind in regards to everybody we encounter. To train our mind to have the wish that they have happiness in its causes. Yeah? And so to have that as the basic way of relating to people. Then, when we see some of these people in situations of great suffering, then to generate compassion for them. Yeah? And this is in our daily life when we see, you know, when we see Ferguson, when we see what's happening in Sierra Leone, you know, to generate compassion when we see suffering. Then, when sentient beings have good circumstances, yeah, so they have what they want, what they need, you know, then how to respond? Joy. Yeah, rejoicing with them. Yeah, having joy at their successes, at their happiness. In other words, not being jealous. Okay? And then when they are just in two situations. One, if they're just kind of going along okay on their own, they don't need our help with anything. Yeah, then to have equanimity for them. Or if they're in a situation where they're quite close-minded and we try to extend an open hand, but they aren't ready to receive it, then again to respond with equanimity. So I had never heard the four immeasurables described like that in our tradition, but I thought, you know, that's really true, and it's a very beautiful way to be able to relate to people in all the different kinds of situations that we find, that we encounter them, because they all fall within that, you know. Basic attitude, loving kindness. When they're suffering, respond with compassion. When they have good things, instead of joy, instead of jealousy, respond with joy. When either they're doing fine and they don't need our help, or when they can't receive it at that particular time because of their close-mindedness, then to keep the door open by maintaining equanimity. Yeah, I thought, wow, that's a really cool way of explaining the four immeasurables, isn't it? Yeah, very, very practical way of doing it. Then, let's see, then, you know, in terms of the bodhisattva path, in the Pali scriptures, there's in one text called the Buddhavamsa, they tell the stories of some of the previous Buddhas, and they tell the story of when Shakyamuni Buddha was Sumedha in a previous life, and when he generated bodhicitta. And I want to find this in the book. I think I quoted it in here because I was so touched by this description in the sutra. So let me find this. The Buddhavamsa relates that in the inspiring story when Gautama Buddha generated bodhicitta in his previous life. Born into a wealthy family, the Brahma Sumedha lived a life of luxury. When his parents died, however, he realized the impermanence of mundane happiness, resolved to seek liberation, and became a matted hair ascetic. Yeah, this was, yeah. There still are, this was before ancient India, but even in ancient India there were matted haired ascetics. Okay. One day he learned that the Buddha Dipamkara, that was the Buddha, the wheel-turning Buddha at that particular eon, the time when Sumedha lived. One day he learned that Buddha Dipamkara and his disciples were to visit the city near his hermitage. Descending from his hermitage, he began to clear the path for them, but was unable to finish before they arrived. As the Buddha Dipamkara approached, Sumedha was elated to see him, prostrated and laid down in the mud, because he couldn't finish clearing the path, so he just laid down in the mud. And then Sumedha relates this moving event, and here's the quotation from the Buddha Vamsa. Loosening my hair, spreading my bark garments, and piece of hide there in the mire, I lay down prone. Let the Buddha tread on me with his disciples. Do not let him tread in the mire. It will be for my welfare. Okay. So when he initially invited the Buddha and his disciples to use him as a bridge across the mud, Sumedha was focused on his own welfare. He knew that if he wished, he could eradicate defilements and become an arhat that very day by listening to a discourse by Buddha Dipamkara. So this guy was very spiritually advanced, could have become an arhat. But questioning his self-centered intention, he made the unshakable resolve to become a Buddha and lead all other beings out of samsara. And so here's the quote, what he thought. What is the use while I remain ignorant of realizing Dharma here? Having reached omniscience, I will become a Buddha in this world with its devas. What is the use of my crossing over alone, being a person aware of my strength? Having reached omniscience, I will cause the world together with its devas to cross over. By my merit towards the Supreme amongst humans, I will reach omniscience. I will cause many beings to cross over, cutting through the stream of samsara, shattering the three renewed existences, embarking in the ship of Dharma. I will cause the world with its devas to cross over. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah? Do you think you would lie down in the mud for the Buddha to walk over you and think like that? So Dipamkara Buddha then predicted Sumedha's full awakening. He would actualize his vow to gain full awakening, become a Buddha with the name Gautama after 4 countless ages and 100,000 eons. Going into seclusion, Sumedha contemplated how to fulfill his aim of full awakening and saw that the main virtuous qualities to develop were the 10 paramis. Okay, so in Pali the word is paramis, in Sanskrit paramitas. Okay, so 10 and 10, actually the Pali has a list of 10. The Tibetan, we usually talk about 6, but actually it's 10, and the last 4 are subsumed in the perfection of wisdom. Okay, now the list of these 2 sets are not exactly the same. There's many overlapping points, but they're not exactly the same. But what's quite interesting is that even in the areas where they aren't the same, the meaning is still found in the other's tradition. Okay, so let me just read you. Okay, I'll read you a quote from Buddhaghosa here. Okay, so having generated the 4 immeasurables, bodhisattvas, first paramita, give gifts. Sound familiar? Okay. Give gifts which are a source of pleasure without discriminating thus. It must be given to this one. It must not be given to this one. Okay. To avoid doing harm to beings, they undertake the precepts of ethical conduct. Okay. They practice renunciation. This is the one that's different. Okay. They practice renunciation for the purpose of perfecting their ethical conduct. They cleanse their wisdom, number 4, okay, which we have, is in the 10 paramitas, for the purpose of non-confusion about what is good and bad for beings. They constantly arise effort, okay, having beings' welfare and happiness at heart. When they acquire heroic fortitude, okay, that's 6, through supreme effort, they become patient with beings' many kinds of faults. They do not deceive, so this one of truthfulness is the 7th, when promising, we shall give you this, we shall do this for you. They have unshakable determination, 8, for beings' welfare and happiness. Through unshakable love, 9, they place them first. Through equanimity, 10, they expect no reward. Having thus fulfilled the paramis, they perfect all the good states classed as the 10 powers, 4 fearlessnesses, 6 kinds of knowledge not shared by Shavakas, and 18 unique qualities of the Buddhas. This is Buddha-gosa. Yeah? What do you find when you study Abhisamaya Alankara? When you look in Lamrim Chenmo on the chapter about refuge, okay? 10 powers of the Buddha, 4 kinds of fearlessnesses, 6 kinds of knowledge not shared by the hearers, the 18 unique qualities of the Buddha. Same. Amazing, isn't it? This is Buddha-gosa is the Theravada of the Theravada.
They didn't even have the concept of bodhisattvas.
But they do, because there is a bodhisattva vehicle set out in the Pali tradition. That's why this whole interpretation, like these people are is ridiculous. Because there is a bodhisattva path. It's not set out as detailed as it is, from the Mahayana, but it's right there, practicing these 10 paramis. And in fact, one of the great Pali commentators, Dhammapala, who lived in South India in the 6th century, he wrote a commentary, the treatise on the paramis, that explains all about the bodhisattva practice. And one of my friends, Bhikkhu Bodhi, some of you may know him, told me that part of that text seems to have been lifted out of a Sangha's bodhisattva bhumi. Yeah? That there, the traditions were taking material from each other. Interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Then for the Mahayana, the 10. Okay, here we call it the Sanskrit tradition. Okay, so we all know, generosity, ethical conduct, fortitude, effort, meditative stabilization, wisdom, and then the extra ones are, let me see, I always forget them. Making it was in the Pali, it's called determination. In the Sanskrit, it's called resolve. And it's where a bodhisattva makes a very strong resolve. Like you get the medicine Buddha with his different vows, Or Amitabha with his different vows, it's because of that paramita where they make a strong resolve to benefit sentient beings. Then you have skillful means, power, and then exalted wisdom. Okay? But those last four are sometimes all subsumed into the paramita of wisdom. Yeah, prajna paramita. Okay, so it's very interesting when you look into the descriptions of how to practice some of these, you know, the unique qualities and also the similarities in them. Then what also really struck me is when I was researching about the view of emptiness, okay, or the view of selflessness, I should say. And so again, there's some differences there, but there's also a lot of similarity. And so I wanted to I think I put some of the quotations in here from the Pali Sutras. Now this has been said by the Blessed One. One who sees dependent arising sees the Dhamma. One who sees the Dhamma sees dependent arising. You ever heard any of your Tibetan teachers say that? Probably. It's right there. Okay. Then here's another one from the Pali tradition, a quotation. This dependent arising, Ananda, is deep and appears deep. Because of not understanding and penetrating this Dhamma, Ananda, this generation has become like a tangled skein, and does not pass beyond samsara with its plains of misery, unfortunate births, and lower realms. So the Buddha is emphasizing the importance of dependent arising. What do you hear His Holiness emphasize? The importance of dependent arising. Okay. Here's another one from Buddhaghosa. Okay, one question for all of the Buddhist traditions historically, and this is also how we got the different philosophical tenet systems. A question is, how is karma carried from one life to the next? Okay, here's Buddhaghosa, okay, who says, yeah, experiencer is a convention for the mere arising of the fruit. They say it fruits as a convention when on a tree appears its fruit. Yeah, he's saying these things exist only conventionally, as a convention, as a term, as a concept. Yeah, that there's no... Oh, here's part of... Okay, so that was an ancient Pali verse. Here's Buddhaghosa's explanation of it. Just as it is simply owing to the arising of tree fruits, which are one part of the phenomena called a tree, that it is said the tree fruits, or the tree has fruited. So it is simply owing to the arising of the fruit, consisting of the pleasure and pain called experience, which is one part of the aggregates called devas, or human beings, that it is said a deva or a human being experiences or feels pleasure or pain. There is therefore no need at all here for a superfluous experiencer. Yeah? Some solid, concrete person who is the experiencer, Buddhaghosa says, there's no need. Pretty amazing, huh? Okay, here Buddhaghosa also says, In the ultimate sense, all the truths should be understood as void because of the absence of any experiencer, any doer, anyone who is extinguished, and any goer. This sounds like Nagarjuna. Yeah. Hence it is said, okay, for there is suffering, but no one who suffers. Doing exists, although there is no doer. Extinction is, but no extinguished person. And although there is a path, there is no goer. This is Nagarjuna, you know? Right out of Treatise of the Middle Way. So similar. So this kind of stuff just blew my mind when, you know, I started reading it. Okay. Let's see if I can give you. Okay. Here's another thing. Here's the Buddha, okay? Those who go by names, who go by concepts, making their abode in names and concepts, failing to discern the naming process, these are subject to the reign of death. Okay, so people caught up in conceptuality, elaborations, the elaboration of true existence especially, because many of these verses, you know, that you take from the Buddha, they can be understood in many different ways. Yeah, according to, for example, what your object of negation is when you're in the when you're meditating on selflessness. Okay, that sutra continues. He who has discerned the naming process does not suppose that one who names exists. No such case exists for him in truth, whereby one could say, he is this or that. Yeah? So there's many more of these kinds of things, and, you know, I was just, there's one section in the Sutta Nipata, you know, that's one section of the Pali Canon that has a lot of these kind of quotations, and it's just like, wow, you know, because we usually hear, oh, you know, they kind of, those Theravadas, they're more like the Vaibhasikas and the Satantrikas, you know, which are the lower tenet systems. Well, true in some ways. When you read some of their Abbey Dharma material, there are some things that are similar. But when you read something like this, straight out of the Pali Canon, yeah. And so, you know, I began to really see these kinds of similarities in the traditions, and how the different Buddhist traditions didn't develop as, you know, so isolated and in totally separate ways as we often think. Okay. I also wanted to read you, because we talk in here also about the Chinese tradition. The Chinese and Tibetan traditions are both close. They're both Mahayana traditions. So this is another point that I make in the book, that because in the West, if you read most Buddhist magazines, they say, you know, there are three main Buddhist traditions: Vipassana, Mahayana, or Zen, and Tibetan. Yeah, not Tibetan, Vajrayana. Yeah, so Vipassana, Mahayana, which equals Zen, and Vajrayana. Wrong. I mean, this is like, I hear Buddhist teachers when I go to conferences say this. Yeah? I was at one Buddhist teachers conference, and they were saying this, and Gelek Rinpoche, you know, gave a talk afterwards and explained it to them. Still afterwards, you read most Buddhist magazines, they talk like this. Anyway, first of all, first tradition is not Vipassana, because Vipassana is a meditation technique. You have Vipassana meditation in the Tibetan tradition, in the Chinese tradition. It's a meditation method. It's not a Buddhist tradition. Okay? Then, Mahayana. Mahayana does not equal Zen. Okay? And actually, Vajrayana is not a separate tradition from Mahayana. It is a sub-branch of Mahayana. Zen is a sub-branch of Mahayana. So is Huayan, yeah? So is Satyasiddhi, so is Pure Land, yeah? In China, you have many indigenous Dharma traditions that are branches of Mahayana, and Vajrayana is another branch. And so actually, and Tibetan Buddhism is not just Vajrayana. Yeah, that's why this thing, you know, Vipassana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, you know, it just makes no sense, because Tibetan Buddhism, you have to practice general Mahayana, and to practice general Mahayana, you have to do that on the basis of what's taught in the Pali scriptures. Yeah, and so, you know, the Tibetans see their practice as having, you know, the foundation of what we call the fundamental vehicle, the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, you know, these kinds of things that all the Buddhist traditions share. Then the Mahayana, emphasizing the bodhisattva path, and then, you know, on that basis, then doing Vajrayana practice. But Vajrayana is not a separate system. Yeah? So that's one thing I'm really hoping this book gets through to people. But back to what I was saying before, you know, we talked in here also about the Chinese tradition. And so some of you may not know the 4 great vows that they have. This is in the Zen. No, actually, I think it's in all the, it's not just Zen, it's all Chinese Buddhism, Japanese, the part of Vietnam that has Mahayana. So 233. Okay, so there was one Tibetan Geshe that was helping, you know, read through the book before we sent it to the publisher. He read these, you know, when he was reading the manuscript, he read this and he said, wow, these are amazing. You know, he had no idea of it before. So, okay, so here are the 4 great vows. Sentient beings are countless. I vow to free them. Defilements are endless. I vow to eradicate them. Dharma doors are limitless. I vow to cultivate them. The Buddha's way is supreme. I vow to attain it. Beautiful, isn't it? And then in one sutra, the Avatamsaka Sutra, that's the flower ornament sutra. It's a Mahayana sutra. It's shared in the, you know, between Chinese Buddhism, you know, all the East Asian Buddhism, also in Tibetan. And for those of you who read the King of Prayers, it is found in the last chapter of the Avatamsaka Sutra. Another part of the Avatamsaka Sutra, another chapter in it, has all these gathas, which are short, like short phrases or slogans, you know, that you practice during daily life, okay? This is exactly where the thought training teachings come. When you read like 7-point training of mind, the precepts of thought training and the commitments of thought training, all those short slogans, when it talks to, and also another thing in the thought training about, you know, when you go upstairs thinking I'm leading sentient beings to enlightenment, when you go downstairs thinking I'm going into the lower realms to benefit sentient beings, when you wash dishes to think I'm cleaning the defilements off of sentient beings' mind streams, all those kind of ways that we practice in the Tibetan tradition and the thought training teachings, they're rooted if in the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is shared by all the Mahayana traditions. So let me read you a few of the gathas from chapter 11 in that sutra. When giving something, this is how you think, may all sentient beings be able to relinquish everything with hearts free from clinging. That's how you think when you give something. In danger and difficulty, you think, may all sentient beings be free and unhindered wherever they go. When sitting up straight, you think, may all sentient beings sit on the seat of awakening, their minds without attachment. When traveling on a road, what you think, may all sentient beings tread the pure realm of reality, their minds without obstruction. When using the toilet, very practical, may all sentient beings discard their attachment, anger, and confusion and eliminate destructive conduct. Yeah? But these are the thought training teachings. Okay? So, I remember when I went to Taiwan to take Bhikshuni ordination, they do the whole ordination in a program that lasts a month or 2 months or 3 months, depending how long you're there. And they teach you all these kind of, gathas to use during your daily life when you're there. And it's thought training. Okay? So, I hope I gave you a little bit of a taste, and hopefully sparked your interest in learning more about how the different traditions relate to each other, because it's really fascinating. Yeah. So, questions? Yeah. Okay. So is it possible that they came up with some of the same points without having talked to each other? I think what's probably more likely is they had a lot of the same material. I mean, they had the early suttas that the Buddha spoke, yeah, and then depending on those, then, because when you look at a lot of the Mahayana teachings, you can see that they're rooted in the early Pali suttas, and that the Mahayana is a more elaborate and a deeper and broader explanation of what you find in the Pali suttas in many cases. Yeah, so I think the same points were in the scriptures, the various scriptures in these different lands. Yeah, but I think what you said could also be true, that when people read this, then their minds are kind of naturally going in a similar direction. What's interesting is that there are some suttas with the same name in both Pali and Sanskrit that have the similar content. There are some suttas with the same name that have different content. There are many things in the Pali, many suttas in the Pali that we do not find in the Kangyur, but the main points exist in the Kangyur or in the Tengyur, because of Sangha, for example, or Vasubandhu, all the great Indian writers, they were quoting many of the early suttas that were around at that time. And so a lot of the meaning from the Pali Sutras came into the Tibetan tradition through that means, because the great Indian commentators were quoting them. Okay, so for example, very good example. In the Pali Suttas, in Precious Human Life, when we hear the example about the turtle who comes up with the golden ring, that's in the Pali Suttas. Okay, the verses we say when we take the 8 Mahayana precepts are almost identical to the verses that you say when you take the 8 one-day pratimoksha precepts, except you leave out the phrase for the benefit of all sentient beings. But that verse is from the Pali tradition. Okay, one of the verses that we chant, like at His Holiness's teachings, it's in here, to the endowed transcendent destroyer. Where is it? It's right at the very beginning. Okay, page 5. Homage to Shakyamuni Buddha. Okay, that first verse there is you have that almost exactly word for word in the Pali. There's a few slight differences. That first one, to the teacher endowed transcendent destroyer, one thus gone for destroy. Okay. So a lot of different things, you find. Also, what's very interesting is, because right now there's 3 extant commentaries, canons: the Pali canon, the Chinese canon, the Tibetan canon. The Chinese canon is enormous, and in the Pali canon they have 5 groups of sutras called nikayas. 4 of those nikayas you have the equivalent in the Chinese canon. Yeah, so the greatest number of suttas that were in the Pali are also in the Chinese canon. There's slight. I have some friends that read both Pali and Chinese that are translating, comparing the suttas that are similar, and there's some differences in them. You can see the different flavor, but again, I mean, it's incredible when you think of these traditions were oral, that you have so much, in common. The Mahayana sutras that we have in the Kangyur you wouldn't find in the Pali tradition, yeah, or the Tantras. But most of the Mahayana sutras that we have in the Kangyur you would find in the Chinese canon. Yeah. Okay. So, we don't actually know exactly what happened, and you're going to get different versions according to whether you talk to academics or practitioners, and amongst academics different versions, and amongst practitioners different versions. It seems like the Buddha did not speak either Pali or Sanskrit. He spoke Prakrit, and he probably spoke a lot of the different local languages because he walked all throughout northern India teaching the different people who had different languages and different dialects. And he somehow managed to communicate with all of them. Yeah. What was the root of your question again?
Well,
about the?
What's the source of those 2?
So the
Pali
canon and the Tibetan. Okay. So the Pali. That's right, how they were passed down. So the Buddha would say things. Here I'm talking mostly about the Pali canon. He would say things, and then at the first council after the Buddha passed away, then Ananda recited all the sutras that he heard, because he was the Buddha's attendant, so he heard everything, and they had remarkable good memories at that time. And Upali recited the Vinaya. Okay. So, and then they had special monastics different groups of monastics who were given different sutras to memorize, and they would memorize them and then teach it to their disciples. So there were all these lineages. They were called Banakas. And that's where the word Bhante comes from, how you address a monastic in Sri Lanka, Bhante. It comes from Banaka. which were these monks whose specialty was to recite different sets of sutras. Now, of course, you know, everybody says, well, the Pali Sutras were the original ones. You know, I don't think you could say that exactly, because if you look in the Pali Canon, there's many sutras that are exactly alike. And for sure, the Buddha did not say word for word the same sutra in 15 different places, just changing the name of the person he was addressing, you know? So, you know, for sure, there were some editing going on to make it so that there were stock passages that could be easily memorized, and then, you know, passed down this way. And so that's how Buddhism first went to Sri Lanka. You know, King Ashoka's daughter and his son, you know, were bringing these texts and brought monastics down to Sri Lanka. And so then they started memorizing the texts there. And then in the 1st century BC, there was a great famine and a lot of people died. And for one of the sutras, there was only one monk left who knew that sutta by heart. So then they thought, you know, by that time writing had become more prominent, then they said, we have to start writing these down because otherwise they could be lost for all humanity, which would be a great tragedy. So they started writing, you know, the suttas down, 1st century BC in Sri Lanka. In terms of the Mahayana, you know, academics will say, well, the Buddha didn't really teach the Mahayana, and these were made up later, either in India or in China, and, you know, and so because the Mahayana didn't start, you didn't start seeing Mahayana suttas publicly until probably about, yeah, the 1st century BC, you know, or around the turn of the millennia there. You know, that's when they began to appear publicly, not before that. And so some people say, well, people just made them up. Yeah. If you talk to His Holiness, he says, no way, you know. And so actually, you see in the Mahayana commentary, Shantideva does it a lot, many of the Indian sages, they go through and they really refute this idea that the Mahayana was made up. You know, His Holiness says, when he talks about it, because if you read like the Heart Sutra, you know, that we so often recite, it talks about that there were, you know, a huge assembly of Buddhas and of bodhisattvas, a huge assembly of monastics. If you've ever been to the site, you know, in Rajgir, I mean, not all those people could fit there. So there were definitely high-level bodhisattvas who were sitting throughout space, you know, that were coming there from one Pure Land or another to listen to the Buddha teach the, you know, the various Prajnaparamita suttas. Okay, so, you know, the Buddha didn't always teach for a human audience. And when there was a human audience, His Holiness speculates that those people kept the Mahayana Sutras very quietly amongst themselves and passed them down, maybe even in a written form, because the Mahayana Sutras don't have the same kind of style and repetitive stock phrases that the Pali Sutras do. So His Holiness says, well, you know, there could be some people who wrote at the time of the Buddha and wrote them down, or some people with incredible memories who could memorize these long sutras and pass them down. Yeah, so you'll find different views about all of that. It seems like at one point, you know, in northern India, Sanskrit became kind of the literary language, and the language of the intelligentsia. And then it was after that, that in South India and in Sri Lanka, you began to have a greater use of Pali. And so some people speculate that, you know, it was kind of like, well, they have a little literary language, we got to have one too. But then also, it wasn't so much us and them at that time either, because you would have different monasteries, and you would have practitioners from both the Pali and Sanskrit traditions, people who were practicing the hearer path and the bodhisattva path, and sometimes they would reside in the same monasteries. Yeah? So, sometimes in the Tibetan tradition, when we hear about that and we hear, tenet systems, Vibhasika, Satantrika, Chittamaja, Madhyamaka, we imagine that there were, okay, the Vibhasikas are over there on that street, and the Satantrikas are over there, and in between they're always just debating because they don't agree with each other. And then you get the Chittamajas over there, they turn everybody on their heads, and then the Madhyamaka's there, and then, and none of them speak to each other, and if they do, all they're doing is debating. No, it wasn't like that. The great monastic universities like Nalanda were full of people from all the different tenet systems, and also the tenet systems were not so clear-cut with the catechism like we read when we study the tenets, when we do the Buddhist philosophy and study the tenet system, that there were so many different groups, different views, overlapping things, and everybody just discussed with one another. Yeah? It was really, in ancient India, quite a rich time. Yeah. It's quite possible, and because Buddhaghosa was in South India, Shantideva in North India, quite possible. Shantideva lived a little bit after Buddhaghosa. Yeah, so quite possible. And I think that it seems to me that Nagarjuna also had, first of all, Nagarjuna was born in South India. Yeah, and so I'm sure he came in contact with the Pali Suttas there. But also many of the Pali Suttas were by that time in Sanskrit and were in North India. And I think a lot of what Nagarjuna wrote was in response to the Sravasti school, which had come about in northern India, they had become quite substantialist. And I think a lot of what Nagarjuna wrote was, he knew the original, the early suttas, and so he was bringing out many of those points to go against what the Sarvastivadis believed in. That's my thought, yeah? Because you see, like the diamond slivers, that things are not born from self, others, both, or causelessly. You see a version of that in the Pali Suttas when Buddha talking about suffering, that it isn't produced by self, others, both, or causelessly. When you talk about the refutation of emptiness, of one and many, that's in the Pali Suttas. Yeah. So it's I'm sure Nagarjuna had access to those, and he really brought out, the deeper meaning of what the Buddha was saying there. Yeah. And then this thing we read in Buddhaghosa about, no goer, and so on. That's chapter 2 from the Karikas, It's, Buddha talked about, it's a fascinating chapter, he dissects coming and going, and where does it happen, Where is the going? It's fascinating. Anyway. Okay, but there's the idea that there's only wheel-turning Buddhas very seldom in the universe. So on planet Earth, there was never a wheel-turning Buddha before. Yeah? So there were wheel-turning Buddhas in other universes at other times in history. Yeah. No, Smeda. Yeah, Smeda. So this was the previous life of the Buddha in a previous world system where Dipankara was the wheel-turning Buddha.
Thank you.
Okay? I gave a Bodhisattva breakfast corner talk at the Abbey that you can find, but I'll give you some of the. I think that you called the talk. I am Michael Ferguson and Darren Wilson. Oh, not Michael Ferguson. I am Michael Brown and Darren Wilson.
That was good.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my own personal beliefs. I was very disappointed in what the grand jury came up with. I have some doubts about the prosecutor, you know, and his role doing that, and how the whole thing was presented to the grand jury, and you know, all of that. I would. You know, I think Obama really captured it when he said, this is not a problem of Ferguson, this is a problem of the entire country. Yeah, and it is a problem of the entire country, and there's a lot of deeper issues that we really need to look at. On another way of looking at the whole thing from a Dharma viewpoint, you know, when I think about just sometimes, you know, we do very small things and they have huge impact. You know, sometimes tiny decisions, but they have major impact. So I was thinking about that whole thing, like Michael Brown walking in the middle of the street. Yeah? It's like, it's a small thing, isn't it? Walking in the middle of the street. And yet, you know, Darren saw Michael walking in the middle of the street, and then he had to, you know, stop that and you know, do something about it. And he made the decision, you know, to call out to Michael and say, get out of the middle of the street. Instead of, he says in his testimony, of course we don't know how much of that is true, but he said he was going to get out of the car and talk to him. But you know, drive-by policing, shouting things out of the car is not very good. You know, it doesn't create good feelings in a community. You know, so both of those were very small actions that they did. Very small decisions they made. Yeah? Walking in the middle of the street. How many times have you walked in the middle of the street? I walk in the middle of the street a lot. Yeah? I mean, even you probably saw me this afternoon. I crossed from, when we were taking a walk, I crossed from Caddy Corner, you know? It's like, yeah. And I didn't even look to see if there was a cop around. But, you know, I mean, it was some small, tiny thing like that. You know, and then Wilson's whole thing about, you know, not getting out of the car, but shouting something to somebody that clearly, you know, made him upset. Yeah, again, small things. How many times have we shouted at people? Yeah, so you see these tiny things that then, you know, small decisions, small choices that then ricochet out and bring all sorts of events and all sorts of repercussions that no one ever thought of at the time they were happening. You know? And so, you know, I mean, clearly there was some karma between the two of them, you know, and some karma with us and all of them as well. But it really made me think, you know, of like, I mean, I could have been Michael Brown. I was this afternoon. I walked in the middle of the street. Yeah? Some small thing. Calling out to somebody, you know, shouting at somebody. People do that all the time, you know? And I was thinking, you know, I could have been Michael Brown. I could have been Darren Wilson. according to these small decisions. So, you know, for me, the Dharma meaning of the whole thing is to be really attentive, you know, and these two mental factors of mindfulness and introspective awareness, to really have them on board and be aware of what I'm saying and thinking and doing, you know, all the time as much as possible, and not let things spin out of, you know, spin out of control by small things happening. And again, you know, not to judge. Yeah, I mean, in the thing, I have my opinion on a legal viewpoint about what should have happened and everything, yeah. But in terms of a Buddhist viewpoint, still having my legal viewpoint, but being able to have compassion for Michael Brown, for Darren Wilson, for everybody in the whole situation. You know, for us as a country, yeah, and despite the progress we've made, the lack of progress we've made, yeah. And so, and I was also thinking that, you know, having lived through the 60s and you know, the freedom riders and the marches on Washington and all of that, I'm very happy to see this come up again, you know? Yeah, it was never gone. But to see it as brought up as an issue for people to discuss and come back to and work on more, and see that it's not going to be just by legislation. It's not, we have the legislation. What we don't have is the change in people's minds. And that's what we need to come to now, is, you know, looking in our own minds and, you know, and practicing the four immeasurables.